And so since then, I have spent probably the third section of my life studying speeches and looking at them from the point of view of how has he manipulated the verse, and what does this actually, what does it mean, but in a very visceral sense of what it means, not in an intellectual sense, but in a working on the level of the emotions and the passion, rather than what it means in terms of an intellectual understanding. So yeah, I think that just about covers my journey.
Wow, that is a very, very fascinating journey right there. So I did want to ask you. So when you're talking about how Shakespeare manipulates language, how does one approach that? Because from an academic standpoint, when we're looking at Shakespeare, we're just understanding it, from a contextual standpoint. Like,
Right.
obviously he's writing this because at that time they were having to deal with rebellions and plots and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Is it something similar to that, or are you looking at it
No,
more from a linguistic standpoint?
no, I'm looking at it straight from a performance point of view.
Okay, can you dive a little bit more into
Yeah,
that?
let's take the most famous line in Shakespeare, and possibly the most famous line in the whole of English literature. I hate calling dramatic art literature because but that's another podcast. To be or not to be, that.
Yeah.
To be or not to be, that is the question. Okay. Now, it's written within the format of iambic pentameter, so you have to be or not to be, that is the question. Well, he could have written the question is the question is to be or not to be,
Right.
which is also iambic pentameter. Now, if you take the line that he actually did write, to be or not to be, that is the question, you have the 5 beats. You also have what is, some people call it a feminine ending. I personally prefer to call it an open ending. That little 11th beat, which falls on the end of the line.
Mm-hmm.
Now, each of the 5 beats, and and this is what I spend all the time. I'm not chopping wood or looking after the dogs doing. Is taking speeches which I've never seen, never read before, and subjecting them to this process. If you take the 5 beats, to be or not to be, that is the question. Now, each of the 5 beats in a Shakespeare line, particularly if it's in iambic pentameter, in perfect iambic pentameter, give or take an open ending. Each of the 5 beats has a function. The first is to introduce. The second is to either reinforce or contradict. The third is the middle beat of the line, so it's kind of the fulcrum point. It's the balance point of the line.
Mm-hmm.
The fourth is there to introduce the most important word in the line, which is the last word. Now, one of the first exercises that I do whenever I take a speech which I've not seen before, or even ones I do know but I'm re-looking at, is to go down the speech and look at all the last words of the lines, and that gives you a very general idea of what the speech is about. And then subject each line to this regularization of the 5 beats. To be or not to be, that is the question. Now, the first thing we get is that the first line ends with the word question. So the word question is going to hang over the whole speech, which is what the speech is about. Some people say it's about, it's an existential examining of one's mortality or whatever. But actually it's not. It's about question. It's about question. And that is in fact, I mean, if you take the rest of the play, that is Hamlet's great tragedy. He's forever questioning. And rather than acting, acting in the sense of actually doing something, he forever questioning. Now, if you take the alternative way that I put that, the question is to be or not to be. Then you have the last word is be, and so the word be will hang over the speech, but that's not the way Shakespeare wrote it. Shakespeare wrote it with the word question being at the end. And if you look at it, the to be or not to be, that is the question. It's in terms of syntax, that's kind of not how we really speak. In fact, the question is to be or not to be would probably be much more colloquial. And so to be or not to be, that is the question. And so you have the word is falling on not only a strong beat, but the fourth beat. And as I said, the fourth beat is there to introduce the fifth being the most important. So it's if you say it and you emphasize, not overly, but you emphasize that is to be or not to be, that is the question. And suddenly that speech, that line, takes on a whole different meaning from a performance point of view. I'm talking not from an intellectual study point of view. That is the question. And we do stress conjunctions and there's an example I use. I'd like some coffee and a glass of milk, which is perfect iambic pentameter, and it's very much the way we speak. But if you subject it to my 5 rules, I'd like some coffee and a glass of milk. So you've got a conjunction and. The conjunction and has fallen on the third beat, being the middle of the line. Now, I'd like some coffee and a glass of milk is a very banal statement. I'd like some coffee and a glass of milk. Mm-hmm. If you stress the and, as an actor, you have the sense that there is some sort of backstory going on here. Yeah. Last time when I asked you for some coffee, you didn't bring me the bloody milk. So, don't forget it this time.
Right.
Or whatever. I mean, the fact of putting the and in the middle of the line and on a strong beat. You see, I stressed and there. Are indications to the performer. And this is, I mean, I have a musicologist who is a friend who is feels the same about Mozart as I feel about Shakespeare, and she said she spent her entire life studying Mozart, and she says I never cease to marvel at the incredible musicology behind Mozart. Now, as a 6-year-old boy, was he a genius at musicology? No, but he just felt it. He knew it. It was his. It was his genius, and the same is true about Shakespeare. I feel. Now, if you take that line, to be or not to be, that to be or not to be, that is the question. And we've got that 11th beat, that open ending. Now, if you look at the next line, whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer, it starts with a trochee. You could not say whether. It has to be whether. So you've
Right.
got a line which is finished with an open ending. And so the next line starts with a trochee. And I've looked at now thousands of Shakespeare's lines which have open endings. And probably about 90% of the time, when he has a line which finishes with an open ending, the following line starts with either a trochee or a spondee. And this helps to break up the ti-tum, 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 ti-tum. Because but it also gives a continuity, because you've got to be or not to be, that is the question, whether it's nobler. So that you have a weak strong, which is running over the end of the line, even though there is full stop after question. That sense of ti-tum is actually running over the end of the line. And so it gives continuity, and hence the musicality. You asked for one example. That's one.
Well, yeah, I remember because I remember in college when I took a literature course, and we were studying the sonnets. We weren't studying the plays, but I remember the professor pretty much emphasizing very briefly what you just explained there. But he did mention that Shakespeare usually started off with he would go in a pattern of stress, unstressed, stress, and he would always end with a stressed vowel. Is that like a valid way of looking at that, or?
Well, our sonnets kind of different, because although they were most poetry, even in that time, was written to be read out loud, but it wasn't dramatic verse. Although there is a great deal of drama, both in the sonnets and even more in Rape of Lucrece and Venus and Adonis. It is poetry, and the plays are not poetry. The plays are dramatic verse, and I think that one should always make the distinction between the two.
Okay. So when looking at poetry, you're going to look at it from a different lens than, say, when you're looking at the plays, because the plays are, I guess you could say the plays there's a more active, I guess, an active context, because they're being performed, whereas with the poems and sonnets, they're going to be more passive, because you're naturally reading them, even if you are reading them out loud.
Yeah. I mean, poetry generally was created to be read in a salon. The poet himself perhaps would stand up in front of the ladies, and mostly ladies, and read the sonnets.
Okay, gotcha.
Read the poems.
Yeah, because it's always been more of a private affair, as opposed to plays, which are more public and out in the open. Okay.
But there was, I mean, having said that, there was the poems and the sonnets were printed very much earlier than the plays. In fact, there was a great reluctance to print the plays. Yes, you talked about the folio, which brings me.
Yeah, I was actually going to bring that up.